So you decided to buy Baldur's Gate 3. You installed it, booted it up, and now you're stuck at the character creation screen because you don't know what to do. In that case, welcome. In today's video, I'll be going over pretty much all the basics that you actually need to know to play Baldur's Gate 3. And since there are several things to cover here, this video might seem a little slow at parts, so I'll be adding timestamps for your convenience, so you can just skip to the parts that you need help with. As always, let's start with creating your character. So first of all, you will be choosing your race and subrace, the primary races being Elf, Tiefling, Drow, Human, Githyanki, Dwarf, Half-Elf, Halfling, Gnome, Dwergar, Half-Orc, and Dragonborn. Now in the early access, or EA for short, races and subraces had varying stat bonuses, which basically made some classes better in combination with certain races. Say as a tiefling, you might get an increase to your charisma stat in the EA, which would be a good combo for a class such as the Bard. However, in the full game of BG3, you won't get any stat increases from any particular race, and so you'll just be able to freely move around your stats instead of having to stick to a certain combination of race and class. That said, your race is still incredibly important for the role-playing of BG3, and since Larian has added an insane amount of reactivity to the game world, your race can not only make some encounters more interesting, but they can completely change how you play the game. An example here is if you choose to play as a Drow. Now, Drow aren't exactly considered to be the most honorable of races, and many others fear them for their dark history, and that includes goblins. Now, you will encounter tons of goblins while journeying throughout Faerun, especially in the early game. And if you play as a Drow, goblins might be more inclined to bow down before you, sometimes even following your instruction to the letter, despite not being friends with them. And so you might have an easier time dealing with gobbos than any other races, like, say, tieflings, who most goblins treat with utter contempt. That said, Baldur's Gate 3 is a huge game, and there's going to be times where situations might be handled differently had you decided to play as something else. Another huge part that's just as important is your choice of class. Now we know that multiclassing will be a thing, so you will be able to invest points into other classes in order to make sort of a hybrid class. Do remember, however, that the more points you spend into other classes, the more you lose out on higher level abilities and spells from your base class, simply because multiclassing in a sense turns you into a jack-of-all-trades class. Now, other than your abilities, you also get access to unique dialogue options and other role-playing aspects depending on your base class, so again, choose your class carefully. Speaking of, there are 12 main classes in BG3, these being Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. In general terms, you would assume that all of these classes fill in certain roles, like the Barbarian, which you would normally assume is a tank class. However, because of multiclassing, which gets introduced in the later stages of Act 1, you can essentially create a spellcasting Barbarian, so you can decide to engage in either close combat or from afar, depending on the situation. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of this, but hopefully you get my meaning. Now, while most classes differ quite a bit in terms of functionality, for example, rogues have access to sneak attacks and barbarians have access to enraged throw, which allows you to throw smaller races at Mach speed, a very common question I see is, what's the difference between a sorcerer and a wizard? Well, at first glance, they might seem like the same class, but they're really not. A simple example here is that the sorcerer has access to something called metamagic, which are skills that allow you to do some pretty wild stuff, like splitting spells in two or increasing the range of your spell by quite a lot. Now, while this might be powerful, sorcerers do not have access to all spells in the game. But guess what? Wizards do, and they can freely swap around spells at any time outside of combat. So essentially, sorcerers are in general terms a tad more powerful, but wizards are more flexible and have access to more spells. Again, this is just a general description, and since there's multiclassing, you will probably be able to create some pretty effective hybrids between the two. Now, after picking your main class, you'll also be choosing your subclass, which is basically a specialization for your class. And as you can see from this list, there's quite a few subclasses accessible in the full game. But to make it easier to understand, most classes have access to 3 subclasses each, with paladins getting 4, clerics getting 7, and wizards having access to a whopping 8 subclasses. To bring an example to how subclasses work, let's take the fighter here who has access to the 3 subclasses, Battlemaster, Eldritch Knight, and Champion. A Battlemaster, like our companion Lae'zel here, has access to skills that allow her to cripple, push, and disarm her enemies, among others, if she succeeds her attack rolls. The Eldritch Knight subclass, however, lets her wield magic, albeit fairly limited magic compared to if she was a wizard or a sorcerer. Again, this is just one example, and I'll dive into the other classes and their subclasses when I actually have some recorded material of the full game. All you need to know about subclasses is that they change the way you play your base class. But don't worry, as I mentioned before, if you're not enjoying your subclass, you will be able to reroll, but I won't spoil how you're able to. Now, going back to stats, it is absolutely important that you pick the right skill points or abilities to make your class as strong as possible. A classic example here is, as a barbarian, you want to max out your strength and preferably constitution as your secondary, with strength affecting your damage and hit chance when wielding strength-based weapons, as well as increasing how far you can jump and how much you can carry, and constitution increases your health. And as a melee class, having a high constitution is always a good idea. Again though, the choice is yours. You can absolutely invest points into strength as a wizard, essentially turning you into Harry Squatter, the boy who lifted. Thank you, dear commenter, for that wonderful little joke. In even simpler terms, if you see a star next to your ability points, that's your primary attribute, and normally that's what you want to invest in whenever possible, up until 20 points in one ability, which is the maximum. Now let's not forget about skills. This is an additional part of your character that makes you proficient with, well, different skills. And having a higher proficiency in something, let's say sleight of hand, means that number will be added to your dice rolls whenever you do a skill check, like trying to pickpocket someone or lockpick something. Now, aside from your class deciding what your base skills are, you can improve some particular skills from your background, which there are 13 of in the full game. A good combination for having a high sleight of hand is to pick the charlatan or urchin background, both of which increase your sleight of hand. There are a slew of combinations you can go for here, and I generally try to make this as balanced as possible, simply because your skills are situational and having varied proficiencies will come in handy for different situations. But then again, it all depends on your personal preference of playstyle. Now, if you've chosen to play as a magic user, you might have noticed that you can select between things called cantrips and spells. Essentially, cantrips are free spells that you can cast in and outside of combat without having to rest. And spells are abilities that use a set number of spell slots that you can use before having to recharge with a long rest at your camp. Normally, I go for damage-dealing cantrips while spells stay situational depending on the playstyle. But generally, a cantrip that deals damage is a must in my opinion, because you never want to be stuck in a situation where you're unable to damage the enemy after your spell slots run out. While we're on the topic of spells, let's talk briefly about how combat actually works. First of all, yes, Baldur's Gate 3 is mostly turn-based, meaning that unless you manage to kill the enemy in one hit, both you and your allies and your enemies will all take turns on what actions to take. And speaking of actions, every time you cast a spell, attack an enemy, heal your allies, or use an item, this counts as an action. And unless you have access to extra actions, which a few select classes have access to, like the fighter, you will have to wait until the next turn to do another action like cast another spell or shoot another arrow. But hold on, you also have access to something called a bonus action, so make sure you use that before ending your turn. Some bonus actions that everyone has access to are jump, dip, shove, and hide. And remember to use these whenever it might give you an advantage, like jumping to an elevated position or shoving someone off of a cliff. All in all, combat might seem complicated, but it really isn't, especially since the full game will have an easier story mode difficulty. So if you just want to explore the game world without having to think too much about this, then don't worry, you will be able to. Now, saying that, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those games that will allow you to choose how to proceed. So you don't necessarily have to get into fights most of the time, and generally you will be able to talk yourself out of sticky situations. Again though, that's where your proficiencies come in, so if you want to do just that, as in persuade people or intimidate them, remember to make sure that your skills are as high as possible in these areas. And that's essentially all the basics of how to actually play Baldur's Gate 3. Now if you want some tips and tricks on specific things, then remember to check out my tips and tricks videos, preferably the second one because it actually contains fully up-to-date information. In any case, let me know if you have any questions down below and I'll try my best at answering them, or if you yourself have some additional helpful information to share, then please do so. As always, thank you to my wonderful Ensven Squad members for supporting the channel, and as always, have a great day. Mr. Olten, signing out.